The woman in the orange safety vest slapped her palm against the hood of my truck and shouted, "You are not entering this neighborhood." Two men stood behind her in matching gray shirts, plastic badges clipped to their belts, both of them staring at me like they had the power to drag me out through the window. Then I looked in my mirror and saw 6 United States Army vehicles turning onto the road behind me. And suddenly everybody who had been pretending to be law enforcement had a much bigger problem. My name is Mason Reed, and before that afternoon, I had spent nearly 2 years being treated like a criminal for parking my own truck in my own driveway. I live in a planned community called Stonegate Hollow, about half an hour west of San Antonio, where the roads curve through scrub oak and limestone hills. The sunsets turn the whole sky copper, and everybody talks about freedom right up until somebody paints a mailbox the wrong shade of brown. My wife, Claire, and I moved there with our 16-year-old son, Evan. After I retired from the Army Reserve and opened a small metal fabrication business in an industrial strip outside town, I had spent most of my military career coordinating equipment movements, fuel deliveries, and field logistics, which is a polite way of saying I learned how to stay calm while everything around me was late, broken, or on fire. Stonegate Hollow seemed peaceful when we bought the place. 81 homes, decent schools, quiet streets, and HOA dues that were high enough to annoy you, but not high enough to scare you. The rules sounded reasonable too. Keep the grass cut, hide your trash cans, no abandoned vehicles, no giant inflatable gorillas on the roof. I figured I could live with that. Then I met Marjorie Vale. Marjorie had been president of the Stonegate Hollow Residential Association for 9 years, mostly because nobody wanted the job badly enough to run against her. She was 60-something, always perfectly dressed, always carrying a leather binder, and always smiling like she had just caught you lying under oath. Her house sat near the entrance, which gave her a clear view of everybody coming and going, and she treated that view like a private surveillance contract. The first time I saw her, she was standing beside her decorative stone mailbox while our moving truck backed into the driveway. She did not wave. She did not introduce herself. She just watched, made a note, and looked at my Ford F-250 like it had insulted her mother. 9 days later, I received my first violation notice. According to Marjorie, my truck was a commercial vehicle because it had a black steel toolbox mounted behind the cab. She cited a covenant banning heavy commercial equipment from residential lots. The problem was, my truck was registered personally, used as my daily driver, and weighed nowhere near the limit described in the rule. I read the covenant 3 times, then handed it to Claire. Because marriage teaches you that when something seems completely ridiculous, it is useful to have a second adult confirm that you are not losing your mind. Claire read it, looked at me and said, "She is making this up." I wrote back politely, explained the registration, quoted the actual wording, and assumed that would be the end of it. 2 days later, Marjorie responded that the board had reviewed my explanation and determined the violation would remain. There had been no board meeting. I checked. She had reviewed it by herself, probably at her kitchen counter, while drinking expensive coffee and enjoying the sound of her own authority. A week later, another notice arrived, this time for visible work equipment. The work equipment was a pair of gloves and a coiled extension cord behind the passenger seat. Then came a warning about a small flatbed trailer parked behind my side fence, even though it could not be seen from the road unless somebody stood on the hood of a car with binoculars. That was when I started talking to neighbors. Across the street lived a retired paramedic named Roy Talbot, a broad-shouldered man with white hair and the patient expression of somebody who had seen every possible variety of human stupidity. Marjorie had fined him because his flagpole light was supposedly too bright, even though the same light had been there for 6 years. 2 doors down, a young couple named Lena and Chris Alvarez had been cited for leaving a child's bicycle beside their garage overnight. Another family had been warned about a garden bench that Marjorie called an unapproved exterior structure. Meanwhile, one of her closest friends kept a fishing boat beside the house all summer, and another board member had replaced an entire fence without submitting a single form. Once I saw the pattern, I could not unsee it. Marjorie did not enforce rules. She rewarded loyalty and punished resistance. She especially disliked people who worked with their hands, people who asked questions, and people who did not act impressed when she entered a room. I managed to hit all 3 categories before breakfast. Claire wanted me to ignore her at first, not because she was afraid, but because she understood how people like Marjorie fed on attention. I tried. I parked a truck where I always parked it, kept the yard clean, paid my dues on time, and answered every letter calmly. But the letters kept coming, each one more aggressive than the last, until the total fines reached $1,200. Then the certified mail arrived. The HOA claimed that if I did not pay within 30 days, it would begin the process of placing a lien against our home. I remember standing in the kitchen with that letter in my hand while Claire leaned against the counter, arms folded, watching my face. Evan was upstairs, music leaking through the ceiling, completely unaware that somebody with a binder had just threatened the house he slept in. That was the moment it stopped being irritating and became personal. I had spent years moving soldiers and equipment through storms, breakdowns, and bad information. And one thing the military teaches you is that panic is just wasted motion. So I did not call Marjorie. I did not march to her house. I called an attorney named Daniel Mercer, a quiet local property lawyer who had built a reputation representing homeowners nobody else wanted to bother with. Daniel read the notices, read the covenanters, then leaned back in his chair and said, "Mason, she is either dangerously careless or she thinks nobody here will challenge her." I asked which one was worse. He said, "Depends on how much money she has access to." Daniel drafted a formal dispute, identified every rule Marjorie had misquoted, and demanded copies of the board minutes authorizing the fines. Then I started knocking on doors. Not with flyers, not with speeches, just conversations, coffee at kitchen tables, talks beside mailboxes, quiet stories from people who had spent years thinking they were the only ones being targeted. Within 2 weeks, 11 households agreed to document what had happened to them. 7 were willing to sign statements. Roy organized everything in a folder with dates and photographs because retired paramedics, I learned, are almost as obsessive about records as retired logistics sergeants. Marjorie noticed. Her smile disappeared when she drove past my house. She stopped waving to Claire at the community pool. Then, one Monday morning, every resident received an email announcing that Stonegate Hollow had hired private community compliance officers to increase neighborhood safety and enforce residential standards. No company name, no license information, no explanation of their authority, just a warning that the officers would begin patrols immediately. That afternoon, a white van rolled slowly down my street, magnetic logos on both doors, and 2 men in matching shirts photographed my truck from the curb while Marjorie watched from the passenger seat. I stood in my driveway and looked straight into her camera, and for the first time since this started, I smiled, because Daniel had called me 20 minutes earlier with a discovery that changed the entire fight. Marjorie had not just been inventing rules. Money was disappearing from the HOA account, and the company receiving it belonged to someone inside her own family. The company was called Hill Country Civic Services, and on paper it had been paid more than $43,000 over 18 months for neighborhood appearance consulting, compliance planning, and resident education, which sounded impressive until Daniel searched the state business registry and discovered that the company belonged to Marjorie's younger brother, a former pool contractor named Randall Pike who had no employees, no office, no website, and, as far as we could tell, no history of doing any of the work listed on the invoices. The mailing address was a rented mailbox beside a frozen yogurt shop. The phone number went straight to voicemail. Every invoice was rounded to an even amount. $3,000, $2,500, $4,000, and each one carried the same vague description. Professional services rendered. Daniel spread the copies across his desk and tapped one with his pen. "This is not proof of theft by itself," he said, "but it is the kind of thing auditors lose sleep over." I asked him what we did next. He said, "We stop thinking like angry homeowners and start thinking like investigators." That suited me just fine. In the Army, emotion could tell you where the danger was, but only procedure got people home. We requested the full financial records, board meeting minutes, vendor contracts, voting records, and all correspondence relating to Hill Country Civic Services. The management company, Bellwether Residential Partners, had 10 business days to respond under the association's own records policy. They waited until the afternoon of day 10, then delivered 3 cardboard boxes that looked like somebody had filled them during a fire drill. Receipts were mixed with landscaping catalogs, bank statements were out of order, and several pages had coffee rings shaped like Texas. Daniel hired a forensic bookkeeper named Nina Shaw, a former credit union fraud examiner with the dry humor of someone who had spent 20 years watching people lie badly about money. She reviewed the files for one day, called us the next morning, and said, "Your HOA did not hire a consulting company. It hired a checking account with a family connection." Nina found 19 payments totaling $43,600, all approved by Marjorie. Several without a second board signature, even though the bylaws required one for payments over $2,000. She also found reimbursements for meals, decorative stonework, and something labeled community leadership travel, which turned out to be a weekend hotel charge in Fredericksburg during the wine festival. Claire stared at that one for a long moment, then said, "I am glad our toolbox helped fund civic leadership." I laughed, but only because the other option was putting my fist through Daniel's conference table. The thing that bothered me most was not the money. Money could be counted, traced, sometimes recovered. What bothered me was how easily Marjorie had made ordinary people doubt themselves. Roy had spent months wondering if his flag light really was a problem. Lena had started bringing her daughter's bicycle inside every night because she worried another fine might affect their mortgage. Claire had stopped posting community health events online because Marjorie had begun leaving little comments under her professional posts. Nothing directly threatening, just poison wrapped in politeness. Interesting advice from a household currently facing repeated compliance action. Do your clients know about the dispute surrounding your property? Claire showed me the comments at breakfast one morning, trying to act like they did not matter. They mattered, not because anybody believed Marjorie, but because Claire had built her career on trust, and Marjorie knew exactly where to press. I wanted to drive straight to her house, ring the bell, and tell her if she mentioned my wife again, that leather binder of hers was going to become the least comfortable hat in Texas. Instead, Claire placed her hand over mine and said, "Do not give her the version of you she is trying to create." That sentence stayed with me. We saved every comment, printed the pages with timestamps, and added them to the harassment file. Roy expanded his neighborhood survey and collected 16 signed statements. A widow named Bernice Cole provided 3 years of letters showing she had been fined over peeling paint on a mailbox the HOA itself was supposed to maintain. A mechanic named Luis Mendoza showed us photographs proving Marjorie had cited his work van while ignoring a board member's construction truck parked across the street. Even one of Marjorie's former friends quietly came forward and said Marjorie kept a handwritten list of residents she called difficult households. I asked whether my name was on it. She said, "Yours is underlined twice." Around that time, the compliance officers began following me more aggressively. Their names were Calvin and Ross, though their badges said Community Officer C. Hayes and Community Officer R. Bell, which made them sound like men who might carry handcuffs instead of two middle-aged guys working temporary security jobs between convention events. They parked near my house, photographed my driveway, and once followed Claire to the grocery store before turning away when she raised her phone and started recording them. Daniel sent a cease and desist letter to Bellwether, warning that private contractors had no authority to detain residents, regulate public roads, or represent themselves in a way that could reasonably be mistaken for law enforcement. Bellwether replied that the officers were merely conducting visual compliance assessments. Daniel read that sentence aloud, removed his glasses, and said, "That is corporate language for we hired 2 guys with badges and now regret putting it in writing." Marjorie did not regret anything. She doubled down. At the next board meeting, she announced that residents who interfered with compliance operations could face enhanced penalties. When Roy asked her to identify the rule authorizing enhanced penalties, she told him his tone was disruptive. When Lena asked whether Hill Country Civic Services had been selected through competitive bidding, Marjorie ended the comment period early. That was the moment the room shifted. People who had spent years looking down at their shoes started looking directly at her. You could feel it. Not courage exactly. Not yet, but the beginning of it. Daniel and I decided the quarterly membership meeting, scheduled 5 weeks later, would be where we presented everything. We needed the room full, the evidence clean, and the complaints filed before Marjorie could bury the records. Nina prepared a formal memorandum describing related party payments, missing approvals, and services that could not be verified. Daniel drafted complaints for the County District Attorney's Financial Crimes Unit, the State Property Licensing Division, and Bellwether's Corporate Compliance Office. I installed front and rear dash cameras in my truck and another camera overlooking the driveway, all time-stamped, all backed up automatically. I was not trying to bait anyone. I simply knew Marjorie believed repetition could turn an illegal act into a normal one. And people like that eventually become careless in front of a lens. 2 weeks before the meeting. She tried to cancel it, claiming unresolved legal concerns made public discussion inappropriate. Daniel responded with the exact bylaw requiring quarterly meetings and attached signatures from 14 homeowners demanding it proceed. She called the petition invalid. He sent her the calculation showing 14 households exceeded the required 15% threshold. She stopped answering him and started talking about me. At her book club, at the walking group, beside the mail kiosk, she hinted that I had anger issues, that my military background made some residents uncomfortable, that there were things people did not know about my business. There was nothing defined, so she manufactured fog and hoped suspicion would do the rest. Then she filed a county noise complaint claiming I operated industrial welding equipment from my garage after midnight. My actual shop was 11 miles away, and my garage held a lawnmower, 2 bicycles, and a freezer full of meat Claire bought whenever it was on sale. The county inspector arrived, looked around for 3 minutes, and asked, "Where's the welding operation?" I pointed toward the freezer and said, "Those pork chops can get loud." He laughed, marked the complaint unfounded, and gave me a copy showing it had been filed to Marjorie's verified resident account. Another page for the binder. The Thursday afternoon before the membership meeting, I returned from my shop carrying steel stock and the new set of clamps. As I turned onto Stonegate Hollow Drive, the white compliance van pulled across the entrance. Calvin and Ross stepped out first. Then Marjorie emerged from the passenger side wearing an orange reflective vest over a pale blue blazer, as if a highway department and a country club had somehow produced a single person. She walked into the road, raised one hand, and slapped the other against my hood after I stopped. "You are not bringing this vehicle into the community," she said. Calvin positioned himself near my driver's door. Ross held up his phone and began recording. I lowered my window and asked, "Under what authority are you blocking a public road?" Marjorie leaned closer, smiling for the neighbors gathering on their lawns. "Under the authority of this association," she said. "Your repeated violations have created a safety concern, and these officers are authorized to prevent further non-compliance." I looked at Calvin. "Are you a licensed peace officer?" His eyes moved toward Marjorie. She answered for him. "They are authorized community officers." That was when the sound reached us, low at first, then rising through the limestone hills. The heavy synchronized rumble of diesel engines under load. I checked my rearview mirror and saw the first-hand military vehicle rounding the bend behind me, followed by another, then another. 6 vehicles in all. A reserve engineering unit traveling on an approved route toward a training site west of town. The lead vehicle stopped less than 50 feet behind my truck. A staff sergeant stepped down, took in the van, the fake badges, Marjorie's bright vest, and my block pickup, then walked toward us with the calm expression of a man who had no interest in neighborhood theater. "Ma'am," he said, "I need this road cleared immediately." Marjorie lifted her binder. "This is an HOA enforcement matter." The sergeant looked at the binder, then at the military convoy stretching around the corner. "No, ma'am," he said, "this is now a traffic obstruction, and you are going to move." For once, Marjorie had no speech prepared. Her hand dropped. Calvin stepped away from my door, and Ross lowered his phone. Then the sergeant noticed my veteran plate, looked through the window at me, and gave the smallest nod. I put my truck in gear. The compliance van rolled aside, and as 6 army vehicles thundered past a crowd of watching neighbors, Marjorie stood on the curb clutching that binder against her chest like it was the last piece of authority she had left. What none of us knew then was that my rear camera had captured every word, and 48 hours later, that footage would play in front of nearly the entire neighborhood just before Daniel opened the financial file and asked Marjorie where $43,600 had gone. The clubhouse was already packed when Claire, Evan, Daniel, and I walked in that Saturday night, and I knew before anybody said a word that Marjorie had lost control of the room. Stonegate Hollow meetings usually drew maybe 18 people, 20, if somebody was angry about landscaping. But that night 63 residents had squeezed into rows of folding chairs, standing along the walls, whispering over the hum of an old air conditioner that sounded like it was chewing gravel. Marjorie sat behind the board table with Calvin and Ross positioned on either side of her, still wearing those gray shirts and plastic badges, while her brother Randall sat in the front row beside a lawyer who looked deeply unhappy to be there. Marjorie opened the meeting with her usual polished smile, reminded everyone to maintain proper trash can placement, then spent 15 minutes discussing seasonal flowers as if begonias could somehow bury $43,000. When she finally opened homeowner comments, Daniel stood. He introduced himself as counsel for a group of Stonegate Hollow residents and asked for 15 minutes to present a financial concern. Marjorie immediately said legal matters were outside the scope of the meeting. Daniel smiled, not warmly, just patiently, and said, "Financial management is listed directly in tonight's agenda. Mrs. Arfel, Vale, and the residents who paid this money have a right to know where it went." "You have 2 minutes," she replied. Daniel opened his briefcase. "I can use 2 minutes here," he said, "or considerably more time in a county courtroom." The room went quiet enough to hear the rain beginning against the windows. Daniel started with the enforcement records. 16 signed statements showing rules applied to some households and ignored for others. Roy's flag light, Lena's bicycle, Bernice's mailbox, Luis's van, my truck. One example after another until Marjorie's little collection of isolated troublemakers became what it had always been, a pattern. Then Daniel handed out Nina's memorandum. He explained the 19 payments to Hill Country Civic Services, the family connection, the missing second signatures, and the complete absence of reports, contracts, work products, or verifiable services. Randall shifted in his chair. Marjorie remained still, but her fingers tightened around the edge of her binder. Daniel placed 3 certified mail receipts on the table and said complaints had been filed that morning with the County Financial Crimes Unit, the State Licensing Division, and Bellwether's Corporate Compliance Office. Marjorie stood so quickly her chair struck the wall. "This is a coordinated attack by disgruntled residents," she said. "These documents are being deliberately misrepresented." From the front row, Randall spoke before anyone else could. "Marjorie, sit down." She turned toward him with a look sharp enough to cut wire. Randall stood slowly, holding Nina's memorandum in both hands. He admitted that Hill Country Civic Services was his company and that Marjorie had approached him about keeping consulting work within the family. He said he had received the payments, but claimed Marjorie controlled the invoices and told him the board had approved everything. I do not know whether he was telling the whole truth or merely choosing the safest version of it, but the damage was done. The room was no longer looking at me. Every face had turned toward Marjorie. She tried to interrupt him and he said, "I am not taking the fall for this by myself." That sentence landed harder than anything Daniel had prepared. I stood and felt the notes in my jacket pocket, but suddenly I did not need most of them. I told the room this had never been about a toolbox. It was about what happens when someone gains a little authority and starts using fear to make ordinary people feel smaller. Then I pulled up the dash camera footage. We connected my phone to the clubhouse television, and there she was in full color, orange vest glowing, palm against my hood, Calvin beside the driver's door, Ross filming, all 3 of them claiming authority they did not have. Then the military convoy appeared behind me, followed by the staff sergeant's calm voice telling her to clear the road. When Marjorie answered that it was an HOA enforcement matter, somebody near the back laughed. When the sergeant told her it was a traffic obstruction, half the room laughed. By the time the video showed her stepping onto the curb while 6 army vehicles rolled past, even some of her longtime supporters were covering their mouths. It was not evidence of financial misconduct, but it revealed something just as important. The entire performance depended on nobody asking whether her authority was real. Roy stood and made a motion to place Marjorie on immediate administrative leave pending an independent investigation. The bylaws required a 2/3 majority of those present. The vote was 56 in favor, 6 against, and 1 abstention. Marjorie stared at the raised hands like each one had personally betrayed her. A second motion terminated the contract with the compliance officers. Calvin unclipped his badge before the boat was even finished. Ross followed him out without looking at anybody. A third motion authorized a complete 3-year audit and the immediate replacement of Bellwether Residential Partners. That one passed unanimously, including the abstaining voter, who apparently found courage when no longer required to look directly at Marjorie. She gathered her binder and walked toward the door, but Bernice spoke from the second row. "You made me believe I was the problem," she said quietly. Marjorie stopped for half a second, then kept walking. I think that was the only accusation she truly heard. The county opened a formal inquiry 3 weeks later. Marjorie resigned in writing before the investigation concluded, and Randall hired his own attorney. The audit confirmed the $43,600 in unsupported payments and uncovered another $11,000 in questionable reimbursements. Bellwether refunded part of its management fees and ended its relationship with the community. 14 outstanding violations were withdrawn, including every fine against me. Roy received written confirmation that his flaglight had always been compliant. Bernice was reimbursed for the mailbox repair. Lena and Chris both ran for board seats, and Lena won with the highest vote total in Stonegate Hollow history. The new board passed a rule requiring public disclosure and competitive bids for every contract over $1,500. My truck is still parked in my driveway, toolbox and all. A month after the meeting, the staff sergeant from the Convoy sent me a message through a local veterans group. He had heard the situation worked out and wrote only 4 words: "Glad the road stayed clear." That made me smile, because the road was never just asphalt. It was the space people need to live without somebody standing in front of them, hand raised, insisting they have permission to control what was never theirs. The neighborhood eventually created a small scholarship for local students entering trade programs, and the first recipient was a kid studying welding. Evan helped me present the award. Watching him stand beside me, proud and a little embarrassed in the way teenage boys get, I realized the best part of winning was not watching Marjorie lose power. It was showing my son that restraint is not weakness, documentation is not cowardice, and standing your ground does not always mean shouting louder. Sometimes it means staying calm long enough for the truth to arrive with headlights behind you. So tell me what you think. Was Marjorie just a power-hungry HOA president who went too far? Or should people who use community money and fake authority face real criminal consequences? And if you have ever been targeted by someone who counted on you being too tired, too embarrassed, or too alone to fight back, share your story in the comments, because silence is where people like that build their kingdoms. And sometimes one neighbor speaking up is all it takes to bring the whole thing down.